there are multiple dimensions of, let's say, competence and authority, multiple, especially in a sophisticated society. And so you're fortunate if you're good at one or two things. Most of the ways you could be competent and generous, you're just not that good at. So first of all, I would say don't be too disheartened, especially if you're young, because of course you're useless when you're young and male. It's like, of course you are. It's a very difficult thing to take your place in the world. And so you don't want to be disheartened because that's the situation that you're in. It's like, yeah, of course that's the situation you're in. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I was often asked by my students and my clients who didn't know what they should do with their lives. Well, I don't have any goals. I don't know what I want to do with my life. What should I do? And part of the problem is the question, what should I do with my life, is not a very good question, because it's sort of like, tell me about everything. It's just too much. What do you do with your life? Well, you say, you do many things. Okay, what are those things? Because I don't know what to do. Well, why don't we look at what other people do that appear to give their lives significance and meaning? And this bears on the issue of responsibility. Well, most people want to have or do have an intimate partner. So if you don't have one, hey, work on that. And how do you work on that? Well, you don't work on that by going to find the person that's right for you. It's like, who the hell are you? And what makes you think that even if you found the person that was right for you, they wouldn't take one look at you and run away screaming? So you might think, well, how about if I be the person that someone else would want? And so a young man has to ask himself, well, what do I bring to the table? Now, the first advantage he has is youth and possibility. And that's really something young men have over older men. Youth is not nothing. It's a real form of wealth. So if you're young and poor, you're young. And you wouldn't trade young and poor for decrepit and rich. So don't be thinking you're poor if you're young. It's an unbelievable source of wealth. And so that's an attractiveness that's there, that's built in. And then, well, then, are you good at anything? And if the answer to that is no, well, how about you start practicing being good at something? Pick one thing. Well, what? Well, not nothing. Pick something. Maybe it's a video game. I don't care. Get good at something. Because to get good at something requires you to simultaneously practice many skills that will make you good at many things. So, for example, I was a dishwasher when I was a kid at restaurants, and I was a good dishwasher. And, you might think that's a pretty low level of achievement. It's like, it's not. And I can tell you in detail why. First of all, most young people who go into restaurants to wash dishes do a terrible job. They show up late, or they don't show up at all, and then they quit after 2 weeks. Like, that's really not good. So what do you have to do if you want to be a good dishwasher? Show up on time. How about show up 15 minutes early? So if you work 10% longer, you make 40% more money. So that's worth knowing. 40% on 10%, that's a damn good return. So that's part of the reason men make more money than women on average, is because men work longer hours. And it doesn't take much extra work to produce quite a return. Partly because any sensible boss is going to be looking for the person who goes the extra mile. And if you manifest signs of going the extra mile, even in a relatively minimum way, you just have to do better than the other people around you, then you're going to get disproportionately rewarded. And so what else do you have to do to be a good dishwasher? Learn the techniques. Stay on your toes. Volunteer to work when other people don't show up. Show an interest in learning to cook. Get along with the waitresses. Maybe get along with the customers. Act like an adult. And all of that's excellent practice for all sorts of things you're going to do later. I stopped being a dishwasher quite soon and started being a short order cook. And that was great because I learned to cook. I learned to clean a kitchen and to run a kitchen and to interact with the waitresses and to have fun with the cooks and to do it all and have fun, because you can have a lot of fun in a kitchen and in pretty much any working class environment. If you're working with decent people, it can be a real blast. It's not intellectual work in that you're not dealing with abstractions, although it can still be complex. That's why we don't have dishwashing robots, by the way. But it can be a real blast. And so pick something. Pick a job. Go do it. Get good at it. See if you can be like the best dishwasher they've ever had. And then you're the best at something. And then you kind of learn what it's like to be the best at something. And Imagine you're trying to be the best man you can. That's your ultimate goal. You don't even know what that is. It's going to be a whole agglomeration of a variety of high-level skills. Well, how do you start that? Well, in any domain. Maybe you play sports. Be a good teammate. Be the best teammate. Maybe you develop your skills in that particular sport and you could be the star. Well, pass to someone else now and then, and maybe take an interest in facilitating the development of your teammates so you can do that. And so develop a vision for yourself. If you could have the life you wanted, what would you have for an intimate partner, or what would you offer? What kind of family would you like to have? Can you put your own family together? Can you reconcile with your father, your mother, your brothers, your cousins? Can you pull your family together? Can you get a job or a career? Can you educate yourself? Can you regulate the draw of temptation, drug and alcohol use in particular, sexual temptation as well? Oh, do you do anything that's remotely resembling civic responsibility? Are you a member of a political party? Do you go to church? I don't go to church because, their beliefs don't match mine. It's like, who the hell cares about your beliefs? You're like 16. You don't even have beliefs. And if you think it's like you're right and the Catholic Church is wrong, well, good luck with that attitude. And that isn't to say that the church, for example, or a political party doesn't need repair, because all institutions are always falling apart and corrupt. That's a story as old as time. That's the evil uncle. But good, you have something to do. Go fix it up. Definition of man. What am I, a biologist? But as it happens, I am a biologist, so I guess I don't have that excuse. Productive generosity is good. I once read a good description of Christian charity, and it was productivity plus generosity, which I really liked, because the hyper empathic types only concentrate on the generosity end of that. It's like, I'm generous, yeah, but do you have any money? No, I'm generous with other people's money. Yeah, well, you're missing half the equation there. And that's really the distinction between conscientiousness and agreeableness from a personality perspective. Those are two cardinal personality traits. And agreeableness, which is basically an empathy dimension, has no correlation whatsoever with success in enterprise, business, creative domains. In fact, among managers, agreeableness looks like it's slightly negatively correlated with success, because hyper-agreeable managers can't say no. They can't discipline their employees. They can't set limits. And they're susceptible to manipulation. So productive generosity is pretty good. There is more to it, obviously, more to being a man than productive generosity. But as a central notion, that's a good one. The productivity requires aim, orientation, responsibility, discipline, all of that willingness to work, that willingness to make sacrifices, which is the hallmark of maturity in the service of a higher goal. And that responsibility, the productive responsibility, should manifest itself in relationship to the individual. So you should be responsible to yourself and your future self, the community of selves that you are across time. And then you should be responsible for and productive for as many people as you can manage. And so that might be first your intimate partner, your wife, second your parents, your siblings, your children, maybe your children primarily, although, there's a trade-off there with your wife. Then your local community, then your broader community. You want to take on all that responsibility if you can, in a sense that's both productive and generous. That gives you something to do. Justify your miserable life to yourself and everyone else. And you need to do that. It orients you solidly in the world if you do that. And it gives you a dragon to fight, a real one. And that's where the gold is. So, as everyone has known forever, and as we continue to remind ourselves, how should you arm yourself? Well, that's kind of what a humanities education teaches you to some degree. Arm yourself with words. Be precise in your language. Right? Say what you mean. Read great men and great women. Make yourself literate. Get your tongue in order. Get it under your own control. Get rid of the ums and the likes and the you knows and the pauses. And get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people. And just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, If you aren't speaking the truth, well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words. So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade. It's the false you. It's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life. You don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody. They were so damn stupid. They were sucked in by it. They're all contemptible. Everyone does it, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness. Partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation. And there's no difference between that in some fundamental sense and demonic possession. So if that's what you want, go right ahead. But what you miss is the adventure of your own life. Because if you say what you think, this is a really important thing to understand. You have no idea what will happen if all you do is say what you think. Because you have to let go of everything. To do that, you have to assume that there isn't anything better that can happen than what happens if you tell the truth, no matter what happens. Because you say, I'll tell the truth and I get in trouble. It's like, well, is that good or bad? Well, it's not so good when it's happening. When you get in trouble, that can be devastating. But in the medium term or the long term, in my situation, I've gotten in trouble plenty of times for things I've said. And many times I thought, that was fatal. That was the end. I said something or it was misinterpreted. But often I said something that I was going to get taken out. I was going to get canceled. And that was the end of my reputation. And every single time, and I hope partly because I didn't say things that I didn't think were true, every single time it switched around. And so eventually the cancellation attempt not only failed, but massively backfired. But man, living in that gap between when the pressure was on, let's say, and it turned around, that wasn't pleasant. But it's certainly adventurous because you don't know what's going to happen. And maybe that is the adventure of your life, right? Imagine that the world was constituted so that the true adventure of your life emerged as a consequence of truth in speech and action. Because that would be reflective of the real you, so it would be you living. And then imagine that the adventure that would occur if you dwelled in the truth would be so overwhelming that it would justify all the suffering. And I think that's true. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people. And they have insanely adventurous lives. And they also get more and more and more competent. I've talked to my daughter a lot about this. My daughter runs my companies. My daughter didn't know much about business when she started, and she was pretty sick too, and she didn't know a lot. And so it was easy for people who thought they knew a lot about business to pull the wool over her eyes. But Michaela has the ability to ask stupid questions, and we've talked about that a lot. It's like, you only have to ask a stupid question once if you're alert. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again. You're no longer stupid. So if you ask enough stupid questions because you're honest, well, then you're not stupid anymore. And so that's a good deal. So what can you arm yourself with? In Sleeping Beauty, when the prince, he's entrapped in the castle by Maleficent, who's the ultimate Oedipal mother. She transforms herself into a dragon, which everyone seems to just take as a matter of course, because of course the evil witch transforms herself into a dragon. Like, why we think that's logical is a deep question, an archetypal question. But anyways, he's armed with the sword of truth, and I believe it's the shield of virtue. but the sword of truth. And it's a corny trope in some sense, but it's not corny at all, because how could falsehood prevail against truth? How could that possibly be the case? If what is true reflects what is real, how can what is unreal prevail against what is real? And so, you might not want to align yourself with the truth, because then you will find the dragons. That's for sure, because that's the route that's direct to the dragon's lair. But if you've got the right tools, well, then you can prevail. And so what other tools? Beauty, that's great. Tradition, community, responsibility, all the classic virtues, the opposite of sin. All of that are weapons that you have in your quiver so that you can take proper aim and you can hit the target multiple times. You can hit the cross, the center of the cross, and prevail. And so when you're out to get educated, one of the things I can never understand about university professors, for example, they seem to never explain to their students why you should write. Why are you writing this essay? Well, to learn to write. Well, no. You're writing the essay to get a grade, to pass the course, to get your degree, to go on with your life. Fine. That's the pragmatic side of it. Why write? Well, maybe you're writing about something important, and if you're not, then it's just a lie, the whole enterprise. So write about something important. Why do you want to write? Well, so that you can think. That's what you're doing when you're writing. Revelation, here's some ideas I have. You do your research. Here's some ideas I have. I'll get them down. Then I'll edit the idea, so I only keep the best ideas. Well, now I know how to think about that. Now I know how to perceive that. Now I know how to act on that. Well, now you know how to perceive and act in relationship to something difficult. Well, that's why you learn to write. It's so you can think. And everyone says to their children, think before you act. Well, why? So you can not do stupid things. So why think? So you don't do stupid things. Why not do stupid things? So your life isn't any more miserable than it has to be. So don't do stupid things. How do you do that? Think. How do you learn to think? Write. So why write? How about so you can take your place in the world? Not so you can please the teacher and be some obedient, lapdog. You need to know how to think and speak so you can lead and think and conceptualize and entrance. So all those weapons of directed attention and a sharp mind. And you don't let people who are trying to make you into lapdogs, as I said before, interfere with your ability to arm yourself for what's coming in the future. So, one of the things you want to understand too, if you're a tough, cool kid, especially a guy, is that a lot of the things that are working for you in junior high, your physical prowess and that kind of physical charisma that you might have because you're a relatively tough kid, you need that as you progress. But as you move out of junior high and high school into the broader world, the spoils go to those who can master abstractions, because abstractions scale. And so you have to be able to work at a high level of abstraction in order to become really successful. And you can't get there without being literate and, numerate too, because that's another pathway. If you're more interested in things and gadgets, if you have more of the engineering mind. So, but you want to think of education as the pathway to that sharpness of mind, and you want to think about that and tongue, and you want to think about that as your primary weapons of both offense and defense. And that's not some metaphor. That's, they say the pen is mightier than the sword. There's no comparison. The sword, yeah, fair enough. And you want to be careful of someone who wields a sword, but you wield the pen in a mighty manner. Nothing stops you ever. That's assuming too that you're oriented, in some noble manner. Oh yeah, the adventure. The adventure. Well, the truth is an adventure. Just try that. Just try it for a month. So you have to start by not lying. That's how you start. And so you might say, well, I'm not sure when I'm lying and when I'm not. It's like, fair enough. You probably aren't sure. But sometimes you know perfectly well that you're about to lie or that you just did. And so you can just start by stopping the unnecessary lies. And then you get better at discriminating. So you get rid of the blatant lies. And that means you're going to have to face a lot of detritus left over from pulling those lies along with you. You stop the blatant lies, and then your capacity to discriminate improves. And so then you start seeing some more subtle lies. So then maybe you clear those out. And then you see even more subtle lies, and you start clearing those out. And you start seeing that you say things that weaken you in your own eyes to impress other people. That's a subtle form of lie. And then maybe you stop doing that. And then maybe you do that for 5 years, as a spiritual practice. And then you only say things you mean. Well, man, you will absolutely have the adventure of your life if you do that. So, and maybe that's a great adventure. Because that's one thing life could be. I don't know if you can have an adventure if you're not mortal. Because an adventure sort of implies that you have everything at stake, right? And we have everything at stake. And so you can live like you have everything at stake. And that's an adventure. That's for sure. It might be so much of an adventure that you can hardly tolerate it, but it won't be dull. And that's something, because maybe you want to look back at your life and think, that was rough, but man, it was worth it. And I don't know if you ever get only one of those, because you might think, well, I can scrap the rough. I don't want, at the end of my life, that was rough. I floated through life on a cloud of pillows and nothing ever challenged or threatened me. It's like, no one wants that as their memory. What they want is like dragons, victories, dragons, victories, dragons, victories, something like that. Or beasts, tamed, beasts tamed, something like that. And so, there's a deep theological idea that, well, part of the reason that God gave us free will, let's say, is because it's better for us to come to virtue on our own accord, and it's better to have an adventure than to be safe. And maybe it is better. I mean, what do you want for your kids? Do you want them to get out there and enter into forthright combat with the world and to overcome obstacles and succeed? Or do you want to wrap them in styrofoam and bubble wrap and store them in the basement? Well, nothing will hurt them down there. Well, yeah, except you. And so you want to prepare your children, if you love them, for the adventure of their life. You don't want to protect them. And you do the same with you. It's like, you're not getting out of this alive. You're going to die. You got nothing to lose that you're not going to certainly lose. So you might as well live with no holds barred. And the fastest way to do that is to stop lying, because then it's you that's living. Because you don't know what possesses you when you lie. Like, you think they're your lies. Jung said, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And so when you're lying, you might ask yourself just exactly who's got your tongue. Because you think it's you, but that just shows how much you know. So I wouldn't recommend that. It's not the cat that's got your tongue. It's a hell of a lot worse than that. How should women establish which dragons they should go after and which treasures are worth attaining? That's a good question, because, you could be like Don Quixote and go after windmills. And there's something noble about Quixote, because at least he goes after something. There are at least dragons in his imagination. It's dangerous to go play in traffic. And so you might say, well, I've run out in traffic. I'm dodging cars. I'm playing chicken. Aren't I slaying the dragon? It's like foolhardy exposure to danger. It might be better than no exposure at all. There is something somewhat admirable about that kind of careless bravado that you sometimes see among young men in particular. That's sort of the Bart Simpson approach to life, better than the Milhouse approach. Neither are optimal. But mostly, the dragons that you have to encounter on your way to a worthy goal. So imagine you're trying to enter the castle gates. So you've identified the castle. You know where you're headed. You have an aim. Maybe you want to get a job. You're a young guy. You're 14. You're afraid to go for an interview. But you want to get a job. And you have an idea why. You want to make your own money. You want to be treated like an adult. You want to establish some autonomy. You want to see if you can be useful to anyone. And so you're willing to go get a job, but you're terrified of an interview. It's like, there's a dragon for you. Because you want to fight the dragons that guard the gates of the treasure that you wish to attain. And so that's not foolhardy. It's like, well, why can't I get a job? I'm afraid to be interviewed because I'm so inarticulate. Well, hey, you've got your dragon. And that has to be encapsulated within a vision of the treasure. It's like, if the treasure is worth attaining. And so you got to ask yourself, is this part of a path that I would voluntarily walk down? And if the answer is yes, then you're going to encounter obstacles, some of which might be the size of dragons along the way. And those are the ones that you have to face. And that's not foolhardy. And those are the ones that facing those dragons will force the development within you that's necessary to attain the goal. So, for example, if you're so inarticulate or tongue-tied or shy or embarrassed that you can't face an interview, well, then you need to get your tongue in shape. And that might take quite a while. You might have to practice interviews with a friend. You can find one that'll do it, or a teacher or a principal or another adult, and until you can do it. And then not only do you have the job, perhaps, but you know how to look for a job, and now you're articulate. And so what a deal that is. And you have to overcome your fear of your own stupidity. You know, in the story of Moses, so Moses is called upon by God to lead his people out of slavery. So that's a pretty major task. And you're called in some sense by God to lead yourself out of the slavery of your own foolishness and presumptuousness. And Moses had a speech impediment. That's part of the story. It's not clear exactly what it was, but he believed he was a very unlikely person to bear that responsibility, and I suppose he was. But one of the things you often see with people, like introverts can become extremely socially skilled if they do it consciously. You know, it kind of comes naturally to extroverts. Introverts are often worn out by people and find it draining and difficult, especially in groups. But if they go about it consciously, man, they can become incredibly sophisticated. And, you know, the same thing happens with disagreeable young men who are well socialized. They can become incredibly diplomatic because they've worried the borders so intensely. They know exactly where the rules are. Those are the dragons, you know, the ones that stand in the path that leads to the light. Those are the dragons you take arms against. And you leave the ones that you can ignore, you leave them be. You know, don't let sleeping dragons lie. Right? Because it's not foolhardiness that you're looking at. What are the treasures that you can get? Well, the first thing dragons guard is virgins, so there's that. And you think, well, it's a very bizarre story, right? The story of the dragon, because dragons guard gold and virgins. It's like, what interest do dragons have in gold and virgins? But, well, the girl wants the guy who can overcome the dragon. So that's dead simple and obvious to anyone with even a smidgen of biological knowledge. Of course, women are going to be, what would you say, entranced by the man who can keep the predator away from the infants. I mean, clearly, that's of primary significance. So if you can confront the dragon, you get the girl. And that's, God only knows how old that story is, like millions of years old, that idea. Tens of millions, probably, but certainly millions. And then gold, well, depends on the dragon, you know. If you're afraid of interviews, afraid of public speaking, and you overcome that, you get the gift of a golden tongue. Well, that's something. And so there's a commensurate gain with each obstacle overcome that's in proportion to the size of the obstacle. It's partly because a lot of the potential that lies within you will not make itself manifest without the demand being put to it. And so there's this old idea in the Chartres Cathedral, there's a maze. It's the world, essentially. You enter in one quadrant of this circular maze, in the center of the church architecture, and You walk every quadrant, and at the end of the walk, which is a symbolic pilgrimage, you get to the middle, to the center where you're supposed to be. And what that means is that to get to where you should be, you have to go everywhere. And that's why young men often, and young women as well, are called to, they want to travel. They want to go see the world. Well, why? Because they want to get away from their father's tent and their mother's love and go hit themselves against the world, to see different things, to become different, to become a multitude of different people, and then to integrate all that into the person they could be. And you have to go everywhere and do everything to manage that, to every corner of the world. And every time you do that, you gain more information, but you turn things on inside of you that you don't even know are there. And that's the same as reactivating the ancestral father. It's the same thing. Because all that biological capacity is in some sense nested inside you, maybe coded at the genetic level. We know that if you stress yourself in particular ways, especially voluntarily, new genes turn on and code for new proteins. Like you literally build new modules. They're there in latent form. It's not much different than, when you go to the gym and you start lifting weights, well, your body's going to transform, but it's not going to do that if you just sit around. You have to face your being with the necessity of transformation, and then all sorts of new things that you had no idea you were capable of will make themselves manifest. And that's all part of that pattern of voluntary confrontation. That's the core of genuine adventure. Are men becoming more passive? Yes, it appears that in some sense they are. They're becoming more passive in that they're bailing out of society. Boys don't do as well in school pretty much from day one. They're less likely to enroll in university. They're more likely to drop out. They're less likely to graduate. They're withdrawing. And there is evidence that I think is quite compelling. Perhaps this is most advanced in Japan and South Korea, which have very low birth rates, that young men are even bailing out of the sexual game, even if it's solitary. There's some indication that young men aren't even masturbating as much as they used to. That's how emasculated and demoralized they are. And that's all a consequence of, that's all a consequence of this insistence that all manifestations of masculine will are part of the force that is not only a continuation of the historical pattern of power and oppression, which is, of course, what our society is entirely based on, but the purest manifestation of the destructive human force that's demolishing our beloved earth. And, if you tell boys that from the time they're young, especially if they're actually ethical people, then, well, why wouldn't they be demoralized? Obviously, the right response to that, if it's true, is to be demoralized. But it's a pack of lies right from the bottom up to the highest levels of abstraction. Talked to a man named Marian Tupy the other day. He wrote a number of very good books. 10 Global Trends, I think it's every educated person should know. I really like that book. He just wrote another one published in August of 2022 called Superabundance. And he calculated, there's this idea, a Malthusian idea that, there's too many people on the planet and that we're going to hit some kind of limit of growth and then we're all going to starve. And that was really a big idea in like 1967 with Paul Ehrlich, who believed that we were going to hit a population bottleneck by the year 2000, that there'd be starvation of hundreds of millions of people. And of course, and that commodities would shoot up in price and there'd be scarcity of everything. Typical Malthusian viewpoint. Kind of based on analysis of yeast. If you put yeast into a medium, the yeast will multiply until there's too many yeast for the medium and then they all die. And that's a biological viewpoint, except only if you're simple-minded, because we aren't yeast and human beings are ingenious, which economists know perfectly well, because the economists always scrap with the biologists about this. And there's no limit to the extent of human ingenuity, and there are no obvious limits to prosperity and abundance whatsoever, assuming that we're not stupid. Marian Tupy and his co-author analyzed historical data looking at the relationship between population expansion and abundance, which is a positive relationship in that as there have been more people born, since there have been more smart and competent people born, which is a necessary consequence of that, we've got richer, not poorer. And the Malthusians say, the other shoe will drop eventually. It's like, specify your time frame, buddy. You don't get to have an infinite expanse to prove your hypothesis correct. It's like, human beings might go extinct in 100 million years. It's like, probably we won't worry about that. And if you can't specify the time frame, then you have a useless hypothesis. And a man named Julian Simon actually forced Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, into a corner because he bet him, and a famous bet, that by the year 2000, not only would there not be mass starvation, which there obviously wasn't, but that commodities would get cheaper rather than becoming more expensive. And he let Ehrlich, the biologist, pick the commodities, and Simon won the bet. And Tupy has extended that work to a basket of 50 commodities and has demonstrated now that each child born produces 7 times as much wealth as they consume. So enough with there are too many people on the planet, and human beings are a destructive force, and all male will is nothing but a cancer on the planet and part of the oppressive patriarchy. It's like, that's all. There isn't a shred of evidence for any of that, except that when human systems degenerate, which they do fairly frequently, they degenerate in the direction of allowance for the expression of power, arbitrary compulsion. And so if your marriage disintegrates, you're going to start playing power games with each other. If your friendships disintegrate, same thing. Relationships between children and parents, if they're not optimized, they degenerate into power games. Same in business organizations and political communities. But the fact that our social systems can degenerate into power games doesn't mean that that's what they're predicated on. And I think the evidence, so Frans de Waal, great primatologist, has been studying chimpanzees for a very long time, and chimps have a patriarchal social structure in that the primary structure of a status relationship in the troop is male. There's female hierarchy as well, but the males are predominant, superordinate, unlike the bonobos, by the way, which are closely related. There's a trope that Marxist biologists established that hierarchies are dominance hierarchies, and the dominance hierarchy is dominated by the most dominant male, and that implies the male who's most willing to use arbitrary force and compulsion. But de Waal has shown very clearly that, that sometimes even the smallest male can become the alpha if he has, for example, the support of an older female who has very good social connections within the troop, and if he's extremely good at reciprocal interactions and reconciliation post-conflict. And that what establishes peace and tranquility and prosperity, let's say, among chimpanzees is peacemaking and reconciliation, friendship, essentially, maybe something like the spirit of voluntary play, and an optimally structured social system from the microcosm, say, husband and wife, to the macrocosm, a large corporation or a state, to the degree that that's governed by the spirit of voluntary association and even play, then it's optimized, as Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, was at pains to establish too. So not only are we not governed by the satanic expression of power dooming us to a kind of authoritarian hell, what we're properly governed by is something like the spirit of voluntary play. And so that's all good. That's all necessary to know for young men, because they're taught so often that their ambition is somehow intrinsically corrupt. And the best thing they could do is just, slough off into a corner and maybe die without making too much noise. I had a friend who committed suicide really because he believed that. It took him like 20 years to die. It was pretty painful to watch, but he definitely believed all that. He did everything he could to nullify himself. It was very painful. And so this happens a lot. And then the other thing that accompanies it is, men who quell themselves to that degree also suffer the shadow problem, which is all the unlived life, ambition, aggression within them, sexual desire, that just goes underground. And then, that's what accounts in part for these explosive, violent crimes. Certainly accounts for a lot of gang crime, because gang crime, that's been established beyond a shadow of a doubt, is all status jockeying. So, and of course, men are unbelievably motivated by status concerns, because women primarily choose men on the basis of their perceived status. That's a bit misleading, because women actually use status as a marker for productive generosity. So if you have to sum someone up quick, you might think, does he have resources? But the women aren't, unless they're unsophisticated, they're not really interested so much in the resources, although that's not nothing. What they're interested in is the ability to generate the resources, because that's a much better resource than just resources. Because you could have a useless guy who inherited a lot of money, as opposed, say, to a guy who doesn't have a lot of money but whose prospects are bright. And a sensible woman will take the latter guy over the former, and certainly be in much better condition to have a sustainable and enjoyable relationship. So women often get a bad rap, especially from people in the manosphere, so-called, for being hypergamous, which means mating across and up socioeconomic hierarchies, because women have a preference for men, young women, who are about 4 years older than them, who are as well off or better off than they are. And it's a female calibration mechanism to remediate the inequality placed on women in relationship to pregnancy and infant care. So a woman takes a vicious hit in terms of productivity when she becomes pregnant and has an infant. And so it's in her appropriate interest to find a man who can fill that gap. And she's wired, so to speak, to look for someone approximately as competent as her or more competent. And why wouldn't she? What, she wants another child around? That's not helpful, obviously. And so you don't want to be another child. Now, women who can't distinguish between power and authority, or power and competence, power being the ability, let's say, to use compulsion, will and ability to use compulsion. So that's a good definition of power. Women who can't distinguish that from authority and competence, maybe because they never had a good relationship with a single male in their entire life, they'll quell all of that just to get rid of the power. But all it does is fragment their relationships, make it impossible for them to have a functioning, intimate relationship. They're hell on their boys, and not good for their daughters either. It's a very bad, low-resolution attitude. It can't help but generate resentment. It's a terrible thing when it gets established multi-generationally. So I think Warren Farrell wrote a book called The Boy Crisis, told me yesterday when I was talking to them that every single high school shooter was fatherless. So, I mean, that's a small sample of people, but society seems to be, let's say, degenerating into a more and more woke direction. Well, some of that is pathology of ideological possession, so that's never a good thing when a society becomes more authoritarian in its political requirements. So, for example, many professors now, junior professors, before they're hired, they're required to formulate a diversity statement, which is basically something like a vow to adhere to the tenets of a monotheistic empathy. And it's an appalling political requirement. It's absolutely 100% inexcusable. And that sort of requirement is being smuggled in at virtually every level of social interaction, academia and in business, with the ESG movements particularly. And that's appalling. My response to that has been, don't say things you don't mean, and don't go along with things you don't agree with. I told my kids when they went to school, look, kids, follow the rules, but don't follow stupid rules. Who decides if they're stupid? Well, that's a hard question, because most of the time you should follow the rules. But now and then the rules get pathological, and you have to stand up. He said, if you're going to stand up and break a rule, think about it, and you have to be willing to take the consequences. But there's consequences to not standing up to stupid rules too. And if you think that those consequences are lesser, then you suffer from the delusion that there's an easy path through life. You know, as a clinician, often my clients were stymied, say, in their careers. They had a job, maybe laboring for a boss who wasn't good for them, or they were in a career that wasn't good for them for any number of reasons. And they were afraid to change. You know, they were afraid to put themselves on the job market. They were afraid to face the horror of their CV or resume with its gaps and inadequacies. And, you know, sometimes we had to spend a year strategizing about retraining that would make the CV attractive, to address the avoidance that they had engulfed themselves in up to that point, so they weren't presentable on paper. It's a hell of a thing to face. That's a dragon, right? All your past sins shine out from your CV, and so people are terrified even to open the document often if they're thinking about searching for a new job. And then, you know, it's hard to search for a new job, and you know, you send out 50 resumes, you're lucky if you get one positive response. So the rejection rate is extremely high, which is good to know as a baseline. It's not you. It's like everybody gets rejected 95% of the time. You only have to succeed once. And then maybe you're not good at interviews, and maybe you try hard and you don't find another job. And that sucks, because you actually tried hard and you failed. And so often people pull their punches so that if they fail, they can always say, well, I didn't really try that hard. But that's not very helpful. But usually, almost inevitably, people who put their CVs in order and then sent them out, and then were willing to learn how to be interviewed, and were willing to be rejected 50-1. In my practice, most of my clients who underwent that process doubled or tripled their salaries within 2 or 3 years. Now, it wasn't easy. Like, they really had to work at it. But they were willing to confront what they needed to confront. We know, for example, that self-consciousness, so imagine you think about yourself all the time. What's that associated with? Well, it loads on neuroticism. The more self-conscious you are, the more miserable you are. That's why self-consciousness brought tragedy into the world in the story of Adam and Eve. So the more self-conscious you are, the more miserable you are. It's not about you. Do you want it to be about you? How about if it's about other people? Well, the more you think about other people, if you go into a party and your goal is to make everyone else feel at ease, you won't be anxious. But if your goal when you go to a party is, I don't want to be anxious, all you'll do is think about how anxious you are, and all that'll do is make you awkward, and all that will do is make you anxious, and then you'll have a miserable time at the party. And it's a kind of narcissism. I mean, look, I know people have social anxiety. I know it's terrible. But one of the ways I help people overcome their social anxiety was to say, look, the next time you go to a party, really try to focus on other people. Like, don't try to not focus on yourself, because that you just fall into a loop then. You know, I can't stop not thinking about myself, you know, or thinking about myself while I'm not thinking about myself. But you can really concentrate on other people. Like, when I meet people, I've probably met at least 10,000 people face to face in the last 4 years, probably more. And those were semi-formal meetings where I shook someone's hand and asked them their name. So when someone comes up to you and you want to introduce yourself, if you really pay attention to them, the first thing you can see is you can see their tempo, because people move at different rates. Some people are very quick, some people are very slow, and you can extend your hand in a manner that's exactly matches the rate at which they approach you. And so instantly they know you're paying attention. It puts them at ease. Then you grip their hand and you can exactly match the pressure, or maybe just slightly firmer. So someone with a firm grip, you give them a good crushing, and someone who's gives you a weaker grip. I kind of don't go to the lowest end of weak grip, because I don't like cold fish handshakes. They're a mistake. And so a bit of firmness is all right, but you match that too. And then you ask the person their name, because when people meet me, it's often in situations where they're nervous because of it. They're lining up with other people, and it's an event, and they're nervous, and so they're afraid of making a fool of themselves. And so matching their tempo and their hand grip and looking at their eyes, like really intensely, watching them, then they see that I'm dancing with them, and it makes a little circle of intimacy almost instantaneously. And then if I ask them their name, everyone remembers their own name. And as soon as they manage to get that right, then they're set at ease. And you can get unbelievably good at that. I had to learn that as a clinician, because lots of people would come into my office and they're terrified to be there. They didn't want to be there. It took them like 2 years to get up the courage to go see a therapist. And so part of my job was to make them as comfortable as I possibly could instantly. And a huge part of that was paying attention to them and not to me. And you can get really good at that. Yeah, so when I was a kid, almost all my friends in the town I grew up in dropped out of school by grade 10. Then I had a new crop of friends because I stayed in school. And it wasn't like the boys who stayed in school were more admirable. They certainly weren't to me. They were often more obedient. And it's very hard for tough, cool young guys to differentiate between that kind of passive, mindless, immature obedience and accomplishment. And so they would look askance on achievement at school, because it was hard to dissociate that from just being a teacher's pet, just being a suck-up, or being someone who's hasn't got enough guts to stand up to the system. One of my friends, for example, John Peppard, he was a tough, cool kid, really funny, vicious sense of humor, a lot of older brothers, pretty scrappy kid. He could easily take on guys that were 2 grades ahead of him. When he was 15, 16, he basically challenged our gym teacher to a scrap at the hockey arena. And that was quite the damn challenge. The gym teacher's name was also John, and John was a good guy. I liked him quite a lot, and he was strong. He could do an iron cross, no problem. He wasn't tall. I was about 5'9", I think, and I guess my friend John was about 5'7" by that time, but he was a scrappy kid, and he basically challenged the phys ed teacher to a scrap at the hockey rink, which took a hell of a lot of courage. And John was one of those kids who, he was done putting up his hand to go to the bathroom when he was 15. It's like, I'm not putting up my goddamn hand to go to the bathroom. I'm a man. It's like, you, I'm not putting my hand up to go to the bathroom. And, they kicked him out of school. And I can see why. He broke the rules. But he was an admirable kid, and he went off to work on oil rigs and when he was 16. And that's no job for wimps, I'll tell you. In northern Alberta, where it's like black fly hell and mosquitoes everywhere and 40 bloody below, and you're likely to lose a thumb if you're lucky, and that's all. And, he made a fair bit of money and spent most of it on wild living. But lots of my friends were like that. They were tough kids, and it was very hard for them. They're cynical of things like cadets or Boy Scouts, and man, I tell you, the late 70s, that was a great time for cynicism. We had all the cynicism of the hippies and none of the hope. And all those tough kids, they dropped out, and it was very hard for them to distinguish between compliance and accomplishment. And so for the guys out there who are listening, or who are tough and cool kids and are skeptical about school, what do you want to grow up? You want to be illiterate? You want to be inarticulate? You're going to have to negotiate. You're going to have to lead. You're going to have to convince. You're going to have to think. You want to be highly literate to do that if you want to be cool in the most fundamental sense. You want to be cool like Jocko Willink? That's a good example. Man, that guy's like 3 feet thick. He's as tough as a bloody boot, and he's up at 4 a.m. every day. And he is one literate person, man. He can make an argument. He led his men in his military career. And then, if they did something heroic, he could write up a report and describe what they did in detail and get them promoted and get them recognized because he could communicate. And so if you're tough and cool and you're dubious about achievement, it's like, do it on your own terms, man. Make your own plan. Decide what sort of man you want to be. And then develop the skills. And don't be thinking that it's somehow Oedipal to be literate, because that's a damn fool notion, man. The great men I've met, they're unbelievably literate. And they are compelling when they talk. And people listen because they know what they're talking about. And they speak with authority. So if you're tough and you're cool, you're going to want to do it on your own terms. And our school system's very bad at facilitating that. In fact, it does everything. It was even designed at the beginning to not facilitate that, because our school system was based on the Prussian military model. And the Prussians, who also trained the Japanese to establish their school systems, by the way, they wanted to produce obedient factory workers and obedient soldiers. There was no autonomy. There was no development of autonomy built into that. And so in our culture, which prizes autonomy, and rightly so, our kids are confused, especially the tough boys, because they think, well, it's admirable to be autonomous, and yet I'm supposed to sit here like a good little boy, far beyond the time when sitting here like a good little boy is actually what I should be doing. So they get sick of it, contemptuous of it, but to their own detriment, especially on the literacy front. So make your own damn plan. Develop a vision of who you could be. And you can do that by finding people you admire, notice who you admire, and then see if you can figure out what they're like, and then practice that, that instinct for admiration. That's your undiscovered future self beckoning to you through the guise of someone else. That's why you're gripped by it. And pay attention to that, and don't sell yourself short. Don't let the foolishness of the school system and its inane requirements for passive, slavish obedience dissuade you from taking your proper place. It's not helpful. It won't do anyone any good, and it'll deprive the world of what you have to offer. So that's a big mistake. Nietzsche said, in order to develop, you have to subordinate yourself to something. Voluntary slavery, in some sense, to some end over some protracted period of time. And that's the proper conceptualization of discipline. You take it on voluntarily, and then you do have to subordinate yourself to it. You have to listen. You have to obey, but you can do that with the end of freedom in mind, the goal of freedom in mind, freedom and autonomy and responsibility and generosity, all of that, and authority. And so don't sell yourself short, and don't let the people who demand slavish obedience, that puppy dog style of living, don't let them short circuit your future because, you're not inclined towards that kind of obedience. That's actually a virtue, not a vice, even though it's punished certainly in schools, especially by Oedipal female teachers. Although, there's no shortage of men who are participating in that as well. I started thinking about that likely as a consequence of reading both Freud and Jung. Freud was very interested in the idea that there were both undeveloped and repressed parts of the personality, in some sense lurking in the unconscious. And for Freud, much of what was made or left unconscious was often part of the domain of either sexuality or aggression or both. And so those are, in some sense, monstrous domains. And when Jung developed the monstrous domains, in part because I suppose the most monstrous person we can really conceptualize is a truly sadistic sexual predator. So someone who combines uncontrolled sexuality with uncontrolled aggression. So the essence, in some sense, of monstrosity. And Jung believed that he furthered the development of those ideas with the hypothesis of the shadow. You could imagine that the cast-off parts of you, or the parts of you that aren't well developed, have the aspect of partial personalities because they're states of being, patterns of information, patterns of perception that can possess you. So, for example, if you become very angry, then you may say or do things that not only do you regret soon afterwards, but that you don't even see in some sense as part of yourself. And Jung believed that it was useful to, in some sense, name and imagine the subpersonality elements that might make themselves known, for example, in compensatory fantasies. If you're picked on, you might have fantasies of revenge, sometimes very violent. If you're extremely sexually deprived, or maybe not even that extremely, you'll have sexual fantasies. And if you're revengeful and feeling oppressed, and then you might have violent sexual fantasies. That's a part of you. So let's say that's the shadow. And it might be a part that the more strictly moral part of you, so that would be the Freudian superego, or it would be the part of the psyche that Nietzsche would have described as the morality of cowardice. Nietzsche believed that people often were afraid to do things that other people would disapprove of, say, or that maybe they themselves would disapprove of. They didn't perform those actions or think that way because they were moral, but because they were afraid of the consequences. That's why people can go off the rails during a riot, because they believe they won't get caught. And so the fear disappears, and then the lack of morality makes itself manifest. In any case, Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung all believed that there was often undiscovered value in the cast-off or undeveloped parts of the personality, even if they were grounded in unacceptable sexuality, possibly, or aggression. So someone who's a bit of a milquetoast, let's say, to use an archaic expression, some man whose fundamental orientation in life is to be liked, maybe rather than loved or respected, who wants nothing more than to avoid all possible conflict, and who would never dream of offending someone with, say, an unwanted sexual advance, might simultaneously be restricting himself to such a degree that he poses no threat and commands no respect either among men or women. And what that means, and he may find that extraordinarily frustrating, and that may in turn lead to the generation of rather pathological fantasies, or at least the harboring of an intense feeling of resentment. A man like that needs to integrate some of that cast-off material, the potential for aggression, the potential for sexual motivation, desire, action, needs to integrate that into his personality. That's the revaluation of good and evil from the Nietzschean perspective. Nietzsche wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and one of the things he posited was that in times of moral crisis, both personal and social, that the set of distinctions between what constitutes good and what constitutes evil have to be reevaluated, and that many things that might have heretofore been regarded as evil need to be recast as good. And that's certainly a notion that Jung incorporated into his idea of the incorporation of the shadow. Also, the incorporation of the anima or the animus. So the anima for a man is the feminine part of the personality, and the animus for a woman is the masculine part of the personality. And that would be underdeveloped and also cast off, in some sense, for moral reasons, but needs to be integrated so the personality can have more flexibility in response across a broader range of situations. And so, to some degree, you could conceptualize that, and it is conceptualized in literature as the incorporation of a monster. So, the classic female myth, I would say, insofar as it's not the hero myth, because it is that in part, is the myth that's laid out in the story of Beauty and the Beast. And so, in the Disney version, which does a very nice job of laying this out, Beauty is a entirely commendable female. She's attractive and wise, intelligent, ethical, devoted to her father, but not in a pathological way, independent. She has everything going for her. She's the target of the advances of a narcissistic Machiavellian, Gaston, who's like a parody of masculinity. He's sort of, you might think about him as the feminist's patriarchal nightmare in animated form. He's all bluster, and although he's attractive, it's a superficial attractiveness that often characterizes narcissists. And Beauty is wise enough to actually prefer the beast, who's a beast, but also capable of standing up to Gaston and also prevailing, which is the advantage of the beast-like element, but also capable of being enticed by Beauty, and maybe literally so, into first of all, a productive orientation for his proclivity for aggression, and also into a productive and generous relationship. And Beauty being a wise woman and oriented towards the good and characterized by a positive relationship with her father, which is stressed, by the way, in that movie, wants a tameable beast. And that is what women want. They want someone who's productive and competent, but also capable of enough aggression to keep the real monsters at bay. And that's a very narrow needle eye for women to thread, because you need a man who's aggressive enough to keep the real monsters away, but simultaneously agreeable enough, empathic enough, generous enough to be good with kids, to be good with her, and to share. And so that's a very fine line. And the taming of the beast is, in some sense, the negotiated establishment of that line. So there's a book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts that was written by Google engineers who are quite reliable social scientists when they put their minds to it, engineer types, because they tend to follow the data independent of any political inclination. And they looked at patterns of pornography use among men and women, drawing on literally billions of data points, A Billion Wicked Thoughts. And they found something that had been reported previously, but this was on a very large scale, that men use visual pornography. I don't think that comes as a shock to anyone, but that women's preferred pornographic art form is literary. Women like stories. And they analyzed the canonical female pornographic fantasy. And it's basically, surprise, surprise, 50 Shades of Grey. And so the Google engineers identified 5 categories of men that were often the feature target for the romantic and erotic adventures of the female protagonist in the pornographic stories: pirate, vampire, surgeon, billionaire, and one I can never remember. But you get the idea. High status guy, right? It's pretty disagreeable, doesn't take any nonsense from anyone, sort of floats above the female world in some sense, hard to tie down, but is then entranced by this one particular woman and falls into a relationship with her that's often contentious and conflict-ridden, because there's no drama if it's easy, and then eventually ends up taming him in some sense, which means locking him to her in this erotic and romantic embrace, and accompanied by plenty of hot sex. And so that's the female pornographic fantasy. And it's not any surprise at all to me that 50 Shades of Grey, which is basically that story on steroids, was the biggest selling novel in history and was also extraordinarily popular right in the midst of Me Too. It's exactly what you'd expect if you were a psychoanalytic psychologist, because what you see is that when the culture and the individuals that compose it drift too far in one direction, Me Too would be all male will is potentially corrupted by power and to be regarded with suspicion and legal regulation. Well, that's far too extreme and preposterous. And so what you have is a compensatory fantasy emerge that's highlighting the value that's not being properly attended to by the culture. And it possesses people in an unconscious manner, you might say, in an attempt to bring them back to the middle. And anyways, that's all part of the tameable monster. And so it's a good thing for men to know, because, especially young men, because now in our society, young men are constantly told from the time they're in kindergarten, and maybe even earlier, depending on their parents, that we live in an oppressive patriarchy and that all manifestations of male ambition are nothing but will to corrupt power, and that the best thing for any man to do is nothing, if he is nothing, really. And that's the castrating great mother from the Freudian and Jungian perspective, that's for sure. And that's certainly where we're at in our culture. And it's very useful for men to know that that aggressive impulse, that capacity for aggression, which is also the capacity for competition, is also the ability to protect borders and to set limits and to impose limits, necessary limits on children, all of which is hyper necessary. The ability to be properly competitive in a social realm, and something that can be socialized to the nth degree and be unbelievably useful. So a man who's capable of aggression but has it under control is a way more useful man than one who cannot do that for lack of ability, or because he's imposed or incorporated arbitrary moral constraints on his perceptions and behavior that stop him from being able to say no, for example, because saying no is an act of aggression. Because what no means stop doing that, or something you do not like will absolutely 100% happen to you. And so without that, there's no capacity to say no. And well, if you can't say no, you can't negotiate, you can't move forward, you can't live your own life. You can't put limits on Machiavellians, you can't oppose narcissists, you can't emerge unscathed from people who use empathy in a manipulative way. You can't put constraints on a badly behaving 2-year-old. And so, no and aggression, and integrated aggression, those are pretty much exactly the same thing. How do I find the partner right for me on, internet dating sites? But the question was meant more broadly. And I answered it badly the first 2 nights. And the third night, when the same question came up again, I thought, that's not a good question. That's why I'm having trouble answering it. That's also a very useful thing to know. If you're ever asked a question, you're not obliged to answer it the way it's asked. There's always presuppositions built into a question. The question begs the answer, right? Which is, the question is formulated in such a way that only certain answers are permissible. Religious scientists often do this when they debate religious people. They sort of start with the axiomatic presupposition that the only reliable form of reality is objective reality, and then they Shanghai, in some sense, the unsuspecting religious person into accepting that presupposition. And they say something like, Christianity is a pretty foolish scientific theory, which it is. And so then the religious people lose, but it's because they accepted the terms of the argument without question. In any case, how do I find the partner that's right for me? Well, you could start by not asking that question. How about, how do I become the partner who's right for someone else? And I would say, if you really concentrated on that, then you'd have no problem solving the problem, right? If all you did was to figure out, you're a man, what do women want? Well, they'd like you to be strong. They'd like you to be reliable. They'd like you to be adventurous. They'd like you to be cool. They'd like you to be competent, productive, awake, alert, reciprocal, generous. It's like, well, be all those things. Start working. you're 15, of course, you're bloody useless. So it doesn't matter because you're in the same boat as every other 15-year-old. You expect the world to fall at your feet when you're 15. Like, that's not a favor your parents have done you. You got 10 years, and you can put yourself together pretty well by the time you're 25 if you really take a crack at it. And so if you concentrated on being the prince, you'd find the princesses would line up quite nicely. And so you want to think through what you want from a relationship. And I suppose a casual sort of hedonism beckons. Some boys, young men, are in the hypothetically fortunate position now, partly because of dating technology, that they can enjoy an endless buffet of willing young women. But there's something really psychopathic about that, So imagine you're successful enough as a young man, maybe you're at a university where there's a preponderance of women and you're in the high status young male position. And so you have a pretty decent array of choices in front of you. And so you sleep with a different girl every 2 nights. Well, you don't really sleep with a different girl. You sleep with the shallow representation of a different girl every 2 nights. So because you don't know her, and you might think that doesn't matter. It's like, well, what are you practicing here? You're practicing to use other people in the most intimate possible manner as nothing but an instrumental ends to your own short-term hedonic pleasure. That's psychopathy. That's what that is. You practice that 100 times, guess what you are? And if you think that's going to serve you well for the rest of your life, you're sadly mistaken, because it's not. And so your sexual behavior should be encapsulated within a global, and I would say even theologically based ethic, but we could start just with philosophically based. It's like, well, you want to have a relationship with someone? You want someone around you can trust? You want someone around you can tie your life to in this way that weaves a rope? Do you want someone you can grow old with? Do you want someone to be a mother for your children, assuming you want children? And if you don't want children, well, you probably will. And if you don't, you're either deluded or immature. So, and you might say, well, no, the planet has too many people on it. It's like, yeah, whatever. Good luck with that. And so every single one of your ancestors reproduced in an unending procession lasting 3.5 billion years. And they're all wrong and you're right. It's like, I don't think so. So you can just drop that. And if you're not sensible enough to see why a stable monogamous relationship with children is the right outcome, then you've been badly served by your culture. You're narcissistic, shallow, immature, underdeveloped, and deluded, at least in part by your own hedonism. I'm polygamous. It's like, yeah, whatever, or polyamorous or whatever the hell it is that you think you are now. We know there's a couple of stable solutions to the whole set of problems that life presents. And monogamous, heterosexual coupling is the best solution we know. Now, does that work for everyone? No. And it doesn't work perfectly for anyone because we're all flawed and inadequate. But as a basic rule of thumb from which you deviate at your peril, that's the canonical norm and the appropriate ideal. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't tolerate other arrangements, but we should tolerate them knowing they deviate from the ideal and that there's a price to pay for everyone involved. And so you got to envision this. Imagine you had a partner you actually loved, that you actually respected, that you actually cared for, that you actually found attractive, that was willing to negotiate with you on the erotic front for the rest of your life, which is a very difficult thing to pull off, because one of the things I used to tell my clients and my students when they asked was, well, how fast should a relationship progress physically? Well, here's a rule of thumb. Don't do anything with someone that you couldn't talk to them about beforehand. Well, I'd be too embarrassed to talk about that. Well, hey, maybe you're jumping into it a bit too quick then. If you don't have that level of communicative intimacy, what makes you think that you should have that level of physical intimacy? The communicative intimacy exposes you less than the physical intimacy, obviously. So you're putting the cart before the horse. And if you have a partner that you, assuming that you find each other attractive, which is a bit of a wild card, and a bit of magic, and then you can negotiate. Like, there's no doubt that people in monogamous relationships, all things considered, have much better sex lives. So, and of course, why wouldn't they? So, and you think, well, it's the same person all the time. It's like, well, maybe you lack imagination, both in your approach, but also in your rituals. Good collection of lingerie will do wonders for that, and so you can use your imagination and play if you have a willing partner. And you shouldn't restrict yourself. Like, if it's one of the things, this is part of the incorporation of the shadow, you may have an array of fantasies about what you require on the sexual gratification front. It's like, you could let your partner in on the secret. It's possible that they have some fantasies too that they might be willing to share. And so maybe you can have your cake and eat it too, and so that's worth. And is sex with love better than sex without love? Well, is anything worse with love? A meal? So that's just a stupid question. It's a naive question. And of course, people are afraid of that because they're afraid of being intimate. They're afraid of that kind of self-revelation of vulnerability. And no wonder, because the more you reveal yourself to someone, the more you can be betrayed or hurt. But that's also kind of courage to allow yourself the possibility of being hurt in that manner. Also opens yourself up to the possibility of genuine, genuine what? To your heart's desire and living happily ever after. Right. You're never going to get there without being vulnerable. Men and women say, well, I wish he would be more vulnerable. And it's not exactly clear what they mean by that, right? Because they don't mean be weaker. They do mean, though, be more carefully honest. And that is the basis for genuine intimacy. And that's the basis, in turn, of a stable and expanding relationship. And then you can have your kids. And if you think kids are a burden, then you're an immature hedonist, or you've been watching too many Hollywood movies with like kids that are just brats. It's so frequently the case. It's one of the big failings of Spielberg. All the children in Spielberg movies they're brats. You wouldn't want to be around them for 10 minutes. But that isn't what children are like. If you have any sense, you can have the best relationship you've ever had with anyone in your life with your children. That's the promise of children. They love you. They will love you if you attend to them. And you can structure that relationship so that it's the clearest and cleanest and least trammeled relationship you've ever had with anyone. And if you do that, the amount of effort that you have to put in compared to what you receive, they're not even in the same universe. So the notion that children are somehow a burden, what are they interfering with? What have you got to do that's so important? What, you're going to drink 2,000 less 26s of vodka with your idiot friends at the bar? That's your brilliant alternative to growing up? And, I do believe it's very hard for people to grow up if they don't have children. And people hate it when I say that, because there are other ways of growing up. But it's very hard. And the reason it's hard is because you are not mature until someone else clearly matters more than you do. And if you aren't narcissistic beyond redemption, that definitely happens to you when you have children. And then you're an adult. Even if you're not that good at it, as long as that other person is now something you would die for, and really, or something that you would live for, then you're an adult. And the thing our culture doesn't really understand, with its idiot emphasis on the supremacy of both teenagehood and childhood is that it's way better to be an adult than to be a teenager or a child. When I was 14, I took a good look at my friends and my situation, and adults used to tell me, these are the best years of your life. And I looked around and I thought at my friends and I thought, oh my God, that better not be true, because this is not good. You know, the parties I went to, the music was so loud no one could talk. Everyone was so damn drunk they were falling on their faces. And if they weren't drunk, they were so stoned out of their minds that they couldn't even communicate. The music was loud and it was dark, so nobody had to see each other. If there was any contact between boys and girls, it was usually drunken and post-interaction regret-laden and dismal, dark, brutal, not good. I swore when I was that age I would remember what that was like. And then I learned as I got older and watched my peers get older that they would reshape their memories of being a teenager and become maudlin and sentimental about those good old days. And it's a kind of delusion that people settle into, but it's not accurate. And why is being not autonomous better than being autonomous? When you're a teenager or child, I mean, there's an innocence in childhood and a freshness that's quite remarkable, you know, and there's something to be said about that. But the lack of autonomy and the lack of ability is a terrible price to pay for that. And I think it's worse when you're a teenager. You have almost no autonomy. And so why isn't being an adult better than that? By a lot. And it might be, the thing about being a teenager is there's still a lot of you that's potential. And you still have the romantic adventures lying in front of you. And you can settle into an adulthood that's stagnant. And in that case, when you retrospectively look at that potential, it can beckon. But that's a failure of development, not an indictment of adulthood. Because if you're an adult and you're mature and you tell the truth, then the world is a horizon of adventure in a manner that is just not accessible to a teenager. So why would you grow up and get married and have children? It's because, first of all, getting married and having children, that's 2/3 of your life. Even if you have a spectacular career, your marriage and your children are going to be, at minimum, as each of them is going to be as important as your career. And that's if you have a stellar and spectacular career. If you just have a job, the job pales in comparison to the importance of your marriage and your family. And so you might say, well, I don't want to get married. I don't want to have children. So, well, that's what people do. That's 2/3 of your life. If that's just off the table, what are you going to replace that with? What are you going to replace that with? Stupid drunkenness with your idiot friends, something like that. You know, or this desperate attempt to keep that teenage hedonistic potential alive. And you see these guys who are 30 or 35 or 40, that's even worse, still at university parties, or even worse, teenage parties, still being the teenager at the party. It's like, you're not the cool teenager at the party. You're Uncle Sticky in the closet. It's not pleasant. So that kind of failure of development, that gets really ugly as people age. And they don't notice, but anyone with any sense keeps their distance, especially if they're drinking. So grow up, man. Why? Because it's way better. If it's done right, it's way better. And of course, that's what you should teach children too. We put children on a pedestal. And you can understand that. I really like being around children a lot. I like children a lot. And I had a blast with my kids. But children should value adults over and above children, not least because they're going to be adults. So if the message to the child is childhood is the apotheosis of your life, it's like, well, it's all downhill after 9. That's kind of a pain if you live 80 more years, just dragging yourself out after you're no longer 9 or 14 or 15, whatever it is. And so that's also why, and I think this is a good message for women, because lots of women worry about their career. You know, is my career going to interfere with my relationship with your children? Does not hurt your children to see you doing something that's adult, that's for you, and that supports the family. There is nothing wrong with that. That's like good role model. And children absolutely 100% need to learn that adults have important things to do and they are not to be interrupted unnecessarily while they are pursuing those things. Not least because the children need to see that that adult pursuit is valuable and worth attaining. So every time you denigrate an adult in favor of a child, you just teach the child that there's no use in being an adult. And then you have Peter Pan, that's King of the Lost Boys, and in love with Tinkerbell. What did I call her? The porn fairy. Yeah, he doesn't get the real girl. It's hard to beat honesty. The basis of my wife and I, we swore that we would tell each other the truth when we got married. We'd both banged around enough by then, so that was pretty serious. And she might have been better at it than me, but we've stuck to that. And that's such a relief. It's such a relief to have someone around that you can tell the truth to, that you have a history of the truth with. And that's especially true the longer you're married, because if you're lying to each other, then those accrue and they turn into a monster that eventually devours you. And you can walk into houses where that's the case, is everything's based on a lie and everyone's walking on eggshells and the closets are full of skeletons and there's snakes under every carpet. It's dreadful. And everyone in that place is hyper stressed. And nobody can ever talk about anything important because divorce is always looming. It's awful. So honesty, that's really helpful. And so what else makes a good husband? Pasty, listen. That's really important. Carl Rogers has good advice for listening. The clinician, he said, you listen, and then you tell the person what they said in words they find acceptable or better than acceptable. Yes, you got exactly what I meant. That's really helpful. You really want to hear what your wife has to say. She thinks differently than you, and you might be wrong. And she might not even know what she thinks. Lots of people don't know what they think till they talk. And so if you don't listen, she can't figure out what she thinks. And then you don't get the benefit of the fact that she can think and that she thinks differently. And that's extremely important, especially when it comes to your kids, because in some sense, the maternal, and men and women can play this out differently, but the maternal spirit says, fundamentally, you're welcome here and this is your home and you're loved for who you are. It's a welcoming and nurturing spirit. But it has to be offset by another spirit which says, you're not everything you could be. And we want to see you develop and leave. And there's a tension between those two things, because in every family and with every child, the question is, well, how much do you forgive? And how much do you embrace? And how much do you say, no, that's not acceptable. You can do better and you should do better. And if you're going to live under this house and you're going to live in peace, we're going to talk till we get this figured out. And that's way harsher in the short term because it causes conflict and it calls the person on their action, but it's much more merciful in the long run. And the patriarchal spirit encourages and fosters independence, and the matriarchal spirit shelters and protects and forgives. And both of those are crucially necessary. And then the question is, well, how do you get the balance right? And the answer is by talking. That's the only way, because one child might need more care, and one child might need more cut and dried rules plus encouragement, very much dependent on the child. And so there's no way of getting that right without knowing the child, but also communicating constantly between the man and the woman. And if that works, then the children have parents that they can rely on and that they can be encouraged by. And that's a great gift for the child. So that's another. And then husband, let's say, and father. Well, father plays differently with children, teases them more, calls them out more, enforces boundaries more, um, shames them more in a manner that's complimentary. That wasn't the best that you have to offer. Is that an insult or is that a compliment? That's a tough question. And what I've seen from young men, and I've talked to many, to say to a 18-year-old, you're okay the way you are, that just deflates them. It just deflates them. You say, you could be a lot more than you are. You could be so much more than you are that the boundaries of that are unimaginable. That's a way better message to someone who's in despair. Because what? You're okay the way you are, miserable, suicidal, nihilistic, hopeless, amotivated, resentful. That's no time for, it's no time for a maternal embrace. It is in a sense, because there's comfort in that, but mostly what that's time for is the clarion call to maturity. It's like, no. No, most of you has to go, man, but the best of you, it can come forward, and that best is there. That's way better. That's way better. And so that's another thing that a father and a husband can offer, and to the wife too. It's many women haven't had a good relationship with a man, and they need that masculine spirit. That would be the animus within, from the Jungian perspective. They need that masculine spirit to say to them, you've got the hero within as well, and that you can pursue that. And that's especially true in the modern world, because women have reasonable control over their reproductive status now, and that opens up the domain of heroic achievement to them. And the woman needs to find the balance, as a man does, but more importantly for a woman, she has to find a balance between that all-encompassing maternal role and operation in the world of heroic achievement. And the man can say, in Sleeping Beauty, when the prince awakens the princess, well, that can be a prince, that can be an external factor, but that can be the masculine spirit of the woman awakening the feminine spirit of the woman. That can be viewed as an internal drama, that the woman has to become the mixture of the prince and the princess. You can read that fairy tale both as a love story and as a psychodrama equally well. And a man can play that role for a woman and see those elements of her that could succeed in the masculine world that she might be doubtful about, perhaps because of lack of paternal support, and identify that, point to it, clarify it, and support it. And that can be extremely helpful. And then, of course, if you're the husband, well, then you have a more competent partner. And unless you're terrified of that, which you shouldn't be, then how is that not good for everyone? And then, then there's the classic elements of being a husband. So when my wife and I got married when we were about late 20s, I'd known her for like 21 years by then, but that's when we got married. And she wanted to have a child pretty much immediately. And I was still in graduate school. And so I didn't have my career set up. I had good prospects in front of me, but I wasn't stably set up financially. And I had no idea where I was going to move, because if you're looking for an academic position, you have to be willing to move anywhere in North America. It's really that broad, because academic positions are rare and hard to find, and at any given time there might only be a few dozen available, and you can't work at the university that you graduated from. That's forbidden by custom. So you have to be willing to move anywhere. And so that was all looming in front of me, or beckoning in front of me. And she said she wanted to have a baby. And I said, I don't think I'm ready for that, or we're ready for that. But I went away and thought about it. I thought, okay, because I'd learned some things about how to think by then. I thought, okay, I don't think it's time. That's not a very good answer. It's vague. And it's never a good time to have a baby, obviously. So what's the problem here exactly? What's exactly the problem? I thought, I don't really know what to do with a baby, like an infant. I worked in daycare. I knew how to take care of little kids, like once they were toddlers, essentially, no problem. But infants, I didn't know what to do with an infant. And I think most men are like that for obvious reasons. You just have to think about it for 15 seconds and you can figure that out. And I thought, okay, I'm worried about the infant. Am I worried about the toddler? It's like, no, I know what to do with toddlers. I like toddlers. That's no problem. And kids older than that, that's no problem. So that's not the issue. And really, it wasn't finances. It was the infant. I thought, okay, what role do I want to have? We have an infant, and I'm going to say yes. What role do I want? Oh, I can take care of her while she takes care of the infant. And so I can take care of both of them. She has to take care of the infant fundamentally, but I'll take care of her. So I went and told her, I said, okay, well, here's the deal. You want to have a baby. I don't know what the hell to do with a baby. But if you're willing to take care of the baby, I'm willing to take care of you and the baby. And she said, well, I'm willing to take care of the baby. And I thought, okay, well then, okay. And so then we had Michaela very shortly after that. And that's what we did. And whenever she was tired, I'd spell her off. And I mean, I learned how to make a relationship with Michaela when she was an infant, but it took like 6 months before it takes a long time for a man to establish a relationship with a baby. Women get prepared, because there's a lot of changes, hormonal changes and so forth when they're pregnant. They have 9 months to really, for the reality to settle in. And there's lots of biological transformations. With men, it's sort of like this little vulnerable football appears on the scene and you have no idea what to do with it. It's like, well, if your wife is willing to take primary responsibility, then that worked for me. I don't know how effective that is for other men, but I suspect it's exactly the same bloody thing. So that's another thing a husband can do is take care of the wife and infant. That's a good role. And the thing is, it really works for a woman, I think, in the most fundamental sense, because, maybe you're going to have 4 kids in your life. You're a woman, you have 4 kids in your life. That means you basically got 36 months of your total life with an infant. That's it, 36 months. It isn't obvious at all that you want to miss that. And so if you offer a woman who isn't ideologically addled the opportunity to actually have that maximum 3 years and to really engage in that, well, that's a huge part of the adventure of her life. And it sets the stage. You really want to get that right. If you want to have a good relationship with the child, those first 6 months, 7 months, when the child is so dependent, crucially important, requires a tremendous amount of physical contact and nurturing and attention, careful, focused, alert attention. And deep down in every woman, regardless of what they say when they're 19, because what the hell do they know? That's a deep dream. I talked to Frans de Waal the other day, a primatologist, and he said, we were talking about interest and toy preferences among chimps. If you give a juvenile female a block of wood, she'll carry it around on her back like a doll. And if you give her a doll, well, that's definitely an infant or a teddy bear. So the chimp females will carry that around for like a toy, like a human child will. If you give it to the juvenile boys, they just tear it apart, see what's inside it. But the female will instantly bond even with a block of wood. That's deeply, deeply rooted inside of us. And if you can offer that to a woman and she trusts you and she trusts herself and she believes that there is something to femininity, the Virgin Mother, if she believes in the archetype of the Virgin Mother, if she's willing to manifest the spirit of Mary, then you can offer her that opportunity. And then you have children that are loved. And that's something. Warren Farrell told me yesterday, he wrote The Boy Crisis. He said that boys who don't have fathers have telomeres that are 14% shorter by the time they're 12. And the telomere is a cap on the end of DNA that determines how many times the DNA molecule will replicate. And that determines how long you're going to live. And so if you're fatherless, by the time you're an adolescent, you're already going to die sooner. And it's particularly true for boys, but it's also true for girls. And so we have no idea how important those early bonding experiences are. I talked about fathers in that situation, but that bonding between a mother and an infant, that first 6-7 months, a tremendous amount of that is mediated by physical contact. God only knows what having that engenders and what being deprived of that produces. So as men move into their careers, how might responsibility and purpose be conceptualized? Well, look, so I always start from the fundamental observation that life is characterized by a fair bit of suffering. There's a tragic element to life. Tragedy tainted by malevolence. And what that poses a problem, and the problem is, well, what can sustain you through suffering and tragedy, betrayal and illness, death, loss, disappointment, frustration, confusion. And it's not hedonism. It's not happiness. Not if you conceptualize happiness in this narrowly pleasure-seeking hedonic way. First of all, that doesn't iterate very well. You know, you can drink a 26 of vodka one night, and that might be a pretty fun night, but you know the next 2 or 3 days are not going to be so pleasant, and you'll probably do at least 5 things that you seriously regret, assuming you can remember what they are. So it's not a great strategy, and everyone knows that you know, that casual, impulsive pleasure-seeking is not, it's not a good game. Everyone knows that. And that doesn't mean you should be afraid to try it, right? That's entirely different. You need to bash yourself around a bit. What did William Blake say? Wisdom through excess. There's definitely something to that. So, you know, walling yourself away from experimentation, that's not a good idea. But falling prey to indulgences, that's a catastrophe. So you can't find, and then if your life is proceeding in a direction that's painful and tragic for reasons that might be really out of your control, obviously you're not going to be happy during those times. You may not have even the opportunity to seek anything that's pleasurable or the ability to experience it. So then what's going to sustain you under those circumstances and sustain your will to live, but even more importantly, protect you from the resentment and the moral corruption that unrequited suffering can so easily produce? And the answer to that is not happiness, but something like meaning. And then you might ask yourself, well, where is meaning to be found? And the answer seems to be primarily through the voluntary adoption of responsibility. You know, so people find meaning in the love they have for their partner and their decision to care for someone else as well or better than they would care for themselves. They find meaning in that, and it can sustain itself across many, many decades, for better or for worse. That's no joke, that phrase. They find meaning in the relationship they establish with their children, assuming they take the responsibility for that relationship. They find meaning in their friendships. They find meaning in their business associations, their civic engagement. People moralize at older people, moralize at younger people and say, well, you should accept your responsibility. You should shoulder your duty. And that's true, but it isn't exactly that you should do it because you should do it, even though you should. It's that there isn't anything better that you can possibly do. Like, you have to justify yourself to yourself. You have to justify yourself to yourself because of your inadequacies and your failure and your error and your propensity to repeat errors that you know you shouldn't repeat, your sinful nature. You have to atone for that. And then you have to justify your life to yourself because it's characterized by death and suffering. And so you need something worthwhile to do. And, well, then you might say, well, there's nothing worthwhile to do. It's, well, you're probably not really in any position to make that judgment, till you've gone all in at least one thing. At least one thing. Because, who the hell are you? You're 16, you're cynical and nihilistic. It's like, you're not wise. You're not a philosopher. You don't know anything. And thank God, right? Because you don't even want to think you know anything because you're bloody miserable and you're suffering. And so if you're also right, well, then you're doomed. So you better bloody well pray that your cynicism and nihilism, unearned though it may be, is based on a fundamental falsehood. And it is. You can find deep significance in your life, and you find it essentially through the decision to voluntarily bear your suffering and to trudge uphill nonetheless. And there's something heroic about that in the most fundamental sense. And that heroism is something so deeply meaningful that it, in some sense, triumphs over even death. And so, as you move forward through life, you mature, you start by developing responsibility for yourself, your friends, your roommates. Then you take on a partner and you have a family, and you expand the domain of responsibility and generosity, and you want to expand that. Who knows how much you can expand that? You could be a credit to the nation. Well, there's an aim. Why don't you aim to be like credit to the nation by the time you're 50? Because what, you got something better to do than that? And the answer to that's no. And, what are you going to do? You're going to pursue endless one-night stands. You're going to bury yourself nose deep in cocaine. You're going to become an alcoholic. You're going to pursue that tinsely, trashy hedonism that is nothing but destructive and generates nothing but self-contempt, and then bitterness, then misery, then vengefulness. It's like, why do that? I mean, it's easier in some sense, right? Although it's not, because it's rife with catastrophe and suffering. So it's way better to envision yourself as, that's the cross image fundamentally, right? The pathway to redemption is to bear your cross up the hill voluntarily. It's a hell of a thing to ask, right? Because you have to accept the fundamental limits of your mortal vulnerability. And you have to say to yourself, I will do good nonetheless. Right? And that's not obedience. That's not naivete. That's a cold decision, man. So everyone great makes that decision. So make that decision, because maybe you're great, despite what people tell you. The sacrifice that women make, especially in relationship to infants, is pretty obvious and should be celebrated, which is why the image of the Divine Mother and the infant is a sacred image. And any society that doesn't hold that as sacred is off the rails in some fundamental manner, regardless of what anyone says. And that's not merely a Christian image by any stretch of the imagination. The Egyptians had images of Isis with Horus on her lap that are clear prefigurations of the images of Mary and Christ. Of course, this society has to worship the mother and the infant, because, well, obviously, if you can't see that, or if you don't want to accept that, I don't know what you're rebelling against, but it's certainly the spirit of life itself. So that's not going to work out well for you or anyone that is around you. Mothers, they need to trust. You need to trust your husband. And that's a hard thing to ask when you're trying to trust him in relationship to your kids, because your fundamental instinct is going to be to protect your kids. But that's not the only instinct you should manifest, because you also have to nurture their development as well as protect them. And so that's a competing force. And you might say, well, why should I trust a man? Of course, a man could say that about a woman too, but the woman could say, well, why should I trust a man, especially when I have vulnerable children? And the answer is, because you're courageous. Because that's the best thing to teach your children, that courageous trust. And because if you manifest that courageous trust, you have the best chance of calling out the corresponding behavior from your husband. And so it's not a matter of naivety. It's not a matter of ignorance. It's not a matter of willful blindness or of wishful thinking. It's a matter of courage. It's like, here, you take the baby. And then the woman has to let that happen, and have the confidence to allow the father to do the things he's going to do, to engage in rough and tumble play, to set boundaries, to encourage, but also within bounds. Paradise is a walled garden. So you could think that the woman, in some sense, tends the garden, but the man, he puts up the walls and makes sure that they're patrolled, and that the walls are also limits for the children. And you don't get paradise without the walls. And hopefully you can do that with your wife in the spirit of play. And then your household is functioning properly to the degree that the spirit of play governs, rules. Then that's a sign that the negotiation has proceeded properly and that the children are in the garden playing like they should. It's incumbent upon mothers to find it in their realm of courage. And that's part of that myth of facing the beast. Of course, you're offering your child to a beast. But the way to tame him is to seduce him with the child. And that's risky, man. But hey, it's not as risky as not doing it. So that's the thing, is that there's no risk pathways. There's just your choice of poison. I've seen lots of mothers, I saw this all the time when we had little kids. The father would start to interact with the child and the mother would interfere, like right now. She just shut him down. And because she didn't trust him fundamentally, because she was cowardly fundamentally, and maybe she had reason not to trust him because, people aren't 100% trustworthy. But I saw this in some families, she'd shut the father down 50 times and he'd just stop interacting with the kids. Because, well, for obvious reasons. One thing you want to know in a marriage is do not punish behavior you wish to see repeated. And husbands do this to their wives a lot too, especially if they're the jealous type. So imagine you have a wife that maybe you got lucky and you attracted someone who's a little bit above your caliber, or at least that's what you think. And maybe you're right too, And so she's attractive and you're happy about that in some ways, but what about those other men? And so you go out one night and she dresses up and she looks pretty damn sharp and you're a little unhappy about that because, what about those other men? And so she asks you how she looks and you take that opportunity to punish her for her beauty. You do that 100 times. And you watch what happens. You think, God, you've let yourself go. It's like, no, I pretty much shaped myself into what you allowed. And people do that in marriages to each other all the time. It's a brutal. If you have a dog and you whack it on the nose when it approaches the bowl, it will starve to death. So punishment, judiciously placed punishment, can be devastating. And the most devastating form of punishment is punishment for virtue. Like if I punish you because you misbehave, there's a huge part of you that's like super relieved about that. Hey, it's like, oh, thank God. Children feel this way all the time. Oh, thank God I didn't get away with it, you know? So that's hardly a punishment at all. It's just justice. And that's a relief, you know, to have justice prevail. That's the whole motif of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's novel. And but if you see someone do something good, like maybe your wife took a risk, you know, she really got dressed up, she looks hot, and she took a risk. And so she's self-conscious about it. And you see that, and because you're jealous, you see just the right moment to slide in the knife. Man, you just blow people out of the water doing that. And you do that if you're resentful. And that's a really bad thing to do. You want to watch your partner and the people around you that you love. And whenever they do something that you would like to see more of, this is a great strategy, and it's not manipulative. You got to have some sense of what you would like your family life to be like, your friends, everyone around you. When they do something that you would like to see more of, so you have to be smart enough to know what that is, you want to notice, nod maybe, a glance, or maybe you want to say, you know, I used to do this with my kids all the time when they did something particularly well. I'd say, hey, you know, here's what you just did. Detailed description. That was dead on. And that specificity, that's unbelievably rewarding because everyone sneaks out their best. You know, they're afraid because people are afraid that they'll show their best and then it'll get rejected. And that really hurts. And so people sort of open the door and they like kind of show you their best like that, just a little glimpse. And they're afraid. And then no one notices and they think, yeah, well, you know, nobody noticed. And then they fold up again. But if you see that and you notice and you say, hey, ha, caught ya. That was great. Then they think, oh, wow, I thought maybe that was great. And so I used to teach a fourth-year seminar class, and I learned over some years to have the students, the first essay they had to write was 4 pages, and the next was 6, and the next was 8, but I had them rewrite the same essay. Because if you ever do a serious piece of writing, it goes through multiple iterations, and I wanted them to graduate from that class with having completed one serious essay, hopefully the best thing they ever wrote. And the first essay, like 80% of them they're just bloody dismal. Careless word choice, bad phrasing, sentences that were jumbled and incoherent, paragraphs that made no sense, all culminating to something formulaic and pointless, bad at every level of analysis. And my grading rule was the first essay is worth 5%, but I'm going to slaughter you. And so they could take that because it really didn't have much of an impact on their final grade, and I could be harsh without intimidating them too much. But one of the things I always looked for was generally, even in a really bad essay, there would be 1 or 2 sentences that were good, where the person actually came out of their possession and their persona and wrote something they actually thought. And the sentence would just sort of gleam, and I'd circle that and say, check. More of this. And then the next essay would be like 40% like that. And the next one, depending on how much they worked, 80 to 100%, identifying that what someone does right. This is a great thing to know. This will get you lots of places in your life. You watch people like a hawk, and when they do something good, you don't want to be presumptuous about this, right? You have to be careful when you compliment people. You generally can't compliment people who are way above you in a status hierarchy, for example, because it's presumptuous. But peers, for sure. People you love, generally. Certainly people who are lower in the authority hierarchy than you. But if you can single out something they did, if you're alert to that and you start fostering that around you, people just start doing more and more of it. And then you're just surrounded by that all the time. And that's so, like, how would you want anything better than that? So your primary job is to protect your wife from exhaustion, because taking care of an infant is exhausting, physically exhausting. So you need to pay attention to her, spell her off, and then get to know the child, at your own pace, but get to know the child. You'll see right away, if you spend some time with the child, if you're not afraid, that the personality of that person is already there. It's way in the distance in some sense, because there's only so much an infant can do, but the person's already there. And this is going to be a person you'll know for the rest of your life. And so you want to get to know this little person. And in doing so, you also differentiate that infant from infants. You might be, and this is typical of many men, they're just not that interested in babies. This isn't a baby. This is your daughter. That's a very specific thing. And that's a person, a specific person. And as soon as you establish a relationship with her, it's not just any old generic baby. And that can happen very early. So you want to protect your wife from exhaustion. And you want to establish a relationship with the child. You have to spend some time to do that. And then I would also say, your wife is going to be surfeited to some degree with physical contact. And so you're going to lose some degree of intimacy with her, particularly for the first 9 months. And so you have to get some of that attention from the baby, and that's a good thing to figure out how to do, because you lose on the one hand, but you gain on the other. It's also something you can teach siblings, that they'll lose their mother a bit, they'll lose their father, but they'll gain the attention from the baby if they're good at it, and you can teach them that. But I would also say, negotiate with your wife so that you two have some time for each other, even during that initial period of infancy, maybe less frequently, but some. And then make sure that you negotiate that on an ongoing basis going forward in your marriage. It's really easy for the intimate part of your marriage, the sexual part, to drop to priority 12 on a list of priorities of which you only ever address the top 5. So it's not like it's not important, but it falls far enough down so that it gets ignored. And that's a very bad long-term strategy. You have to, especially once you are married and you have children, you have to consciously attend to the maintenance of romantic intimacy. My observation was with couples that they needed to spend a minimum of 90 minutes a week talking with each other about the domestic economy, about the goings-on in the household, to update each other about what was happening in their lives, in their mutual lives, but also to talk about the kids and the finances and the running of the household. You need 90 minutes. It's just a business meeting in some sense. And then you need at least one period of 90 minutes, but preferably 2 to 3, where you have a date. And so that's a reason, for example, when you have a 2-year-old, is when should the 2-year-old go to bed? Well, how about early enough so you have some time with your wife? So not 10 or 11 or whenever he falls over in an unconscious heap. How about like 7:30? Because then you get to have a life, and you should never, assuming you're reasonably mature and you can talk this over with your wife or your husband, you should never sacrifice yourself to your children to the point where you resent them. And you think, well, I wouldn't do that. I'd never resent my children. It's like, come on. That's like the most common thing in the world, for parents to resent their children and children to resent their parents and sisters to resent their brothers. It's like, don't be thinking that doesn't characterize you. And so you got to put up those limits. How much time do I want to spend with my child? And how much time do I want to spend with my wife? And that's a serious deliberation. And if you get it right, then you have it right. And if you get it wrong, well, that's the rest of your life. So, and then the last thing two last things I guess I would tell young parents: don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And you can jointly agree on that, because if you dislike them, other people will. And your job is to maximize the social attractiveness of your children. Period. That's your job. Well, that would interfere with their creative development. It's like, yeah, no. They need friends, and they need to act well enough so that adults will smile when they're around and interact with them positively without lying. So when you have a child, you have the opportunity to grow up, right? To be a good parent, to be a mature father. But you also have the opportunity to establish a lifelong relationship that could be the best relationship that you ever had, that you ever have. And that opportunity, it's there. It's there for the taking. So it's certainly what the child would want and need. So whatever the responsibility is, that's such a great gift. It's certainly the case that I never regretted having children for a second. I had one very ill child too, and that was very hard. But whatever children take, they give back in spades. So, and if you can't see that, then you need to take the scales from your eyes.